Hello. Since 40k was first published, the Space Marine has been the foundational cornerstone around which much of the universe has been built. They have been there since the very, very beginning, but they haven't stayed exactly the same since that time. They have changed and evolved much as the entire 40k universe has. In fact, in their most recent edition, they have developed strength and toughness that goes far beyond the basic stats that they had in the earliest editions of the game. Not to mention that they are taller now, and there seem to be very many more of them everywhere that you look. Add to that the fact that even though there are more tactical options than ever before out in the real world, from clothes to bags, boots to phone cases, there isn't quite as much call for that term in the 40k game anymore. That is because what was once the standard formation for Space Marines, the 5 to 10 man tactical squads, have now been relegated to the stuff of Firstborn legend. They aren't even included in the new codex. I recently acquired this amazing boxed set from 1990, the Space Marine Strike Force, and it got me thinking about those early Space Marines. From the very first Space Marine miniature, the limited edition LE2 that came out before Rogue Trader was even released, to these incredible Jez Goodwin sculpts, there have been plenty of changes over the years. And the actual formation of those early tactical squads, that didn't happen on day one. That took a little bit of time. And I wanted to explore how we got to a world where the Space Marine tactical squad was the default. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the origins of the Space Marine Tactical Squad. In order to get to the beginnings of the Space Marine Tactical Squad in the army lists of the Space Marines, we're first going to have to talk a little bit about the formation of army lists for 40k. As well as the Space Marines themselves and how they took on such a central role, which shouldn't be too tough because they are literally everywhere. In fact, you will never guess what was featured on the teaser image, one of the first ever pieces of official Warhammer 40,000 artwork that was published in White Dwarf 92 in August 1987, just before Rogue Trader was actually released. It featured a glorious prototype version of the Warhammer 40,000 logo on a beautiful starfield, both of which would turn up on the first pages of the actual published book, even though they were recreated with slightly different visuals. But, of course, you're totally right, there is also a cheeky little chappie down in the bottom left-hand corner, a Space Marine, most likely cropped at the knees, but possibly pretending to be a kid by kneeling in a pair of shoes. Either way, this was an early statement about the central importance of the Marines in the 41st millennium, a literal poster appearance for the soon-to-be poster boys of the game. Of course, the Rogue Trader book cover itself, filled to the brim with struggling Crimson Fist Space Marines, could have been another obvious clue that these Space Marine guys were going to be very important to the 41st millennium. Depicting what appears to be a desperate last stand, John Sibbick's cover shows something that many later versions of 40k would rarely care to suggest: the fallibility and tragic vulnerability of the Space Marines. In this first edition of the game, the Imperium of Man was established as the default, the perspective from which the rest of the universe is viewed. Orcs are mankind's principal enemies, Eldar are sometimes convenient allies and other times dangerous pirates, but always a mysterious and enigmatic other. Meanwhile, in the chapter literally called The Age of the Imperium's armies are depicted as vast, diverse, frequently bigoted, and regularly tyrannical. The most important portion of the Imperial army are, from the very beginning, the Space Marines. The Legiones Astartes is the official title of the warrior organization more commonly known as the Space Marines. It is the most common and most feared fighting arm in the Imperium. Most of its troopers are recruited from feral planets, where traditional warrior castes compete for the honor of becoming a warrior of the gods. That gives the initial impression that the Space Marines are anointed by the gods as virtuous warriors, but of course, they are just as often depicted in the lore as raging psychopaths recruited from Hive World scum as they are brave battle brothers fighting for their glorious emperor. Much of the art in the book paints the Space Marines not as heroic space knights, but as imperialist enforcers, authoritarian troopers, or almost like American soldiers exhausted, broken, and disaffected in their war in Vietnam. Even still, these intriguingly nuanced images of Space Marines feature throughout the book, alongside plenty of pictures of Space Marine miniatures. They're not omnipresent, there's plenty of other life in this universe, but they are frequently present enough to be considered the stars of the show. It should be no surprise that the Space Marines would take center stage in this burgeoning 40k universe, because before Rogue Trader was even called Rogue Trader, there were Space Marine miniatures. When they were still developing the game, Citadel Miniatures was exploring different types of science fiction model, and amongst them, the first was something very special. Some of them, like the Space Orc and Space Dwarf and the Imperial Troopers, would fit right in with the later setting, even getting repackaged as Rogue Trader miniatures once the game was out. Others, like the Dark Elf Space Trooper, never quite fit in, but that first model, well, it would become an iconic part of 40k even though it predated the publication of the game. Released at some point in 1985, and available at least by September of that year, it can be difficult to pin down specific dates with some of these releases. The LE2 Imperial Space Marine, sculpted by Bob Naismith, was a first attempt at creating a Space Marine model. It was a test case for Citadel's in-development science fiction game, briefed by Rick Priestley and designed by Naismith, and it featured many of the key ingredients that would become hallmarks of the Marines. The beaky helmet, reminiscent of a great bassinet helmet worn by medieval knights. It's shorter than it would become, but it's already present, as is the famous backpack, modelled by Naismith on the doughboy backpacks worn by American troops in the First World War, with their rolled up blankets across the top forming the shape that would become the Space Marines' vents. The multi-piece powered armour, inspired by Roman legionaries, was also a key feature, giving the Marine an imposing heft, which coupled with the forward stride makes for a formidable looking miniature, one that would unsurprisingly become very popular. If you would like to hear a more fulsome account of the development of Space Marine power armour and how that changed over different models and different pieces of artwork and different bits of lore, then you can check out my video that is explicitly about that development journey. But for now, we're interested in the move from the LE2 model all the way to their standard Space Marine and their standard tactical squads. Now, of course, the LE2 model is an incredible miniature, but one miniature alone does not a squad make. Okay, actually scratch that, because in the Rogue Trader book there is a very impressive squad of almost identical LE2 miniatures, but nonetheless there was also a growing need for many more Marine models. The C100 range, also sculpted by Bob Naismith, featured 8 more Imperial Space Marines, all wearing early variations of the power armour introduced with that LE2 model. They were advertised in all their glory in a 1986 flyer. And then, in September of 1987, perhaps the most iconic early iteration of the Space Marines made its debut alongside the release of the game, the RTB-01 plastic boxed set. Sculpted in collaboration by several members of the Citadel design team, and following the initial shapes and components of the Naismith design Marines, this was part of Citadel's first push into a primarily plastic future. The RTB-01s offered a huge variety of options for putting together nearly infinite Space Marines, meaning that you had a huge potential army at your disposal. So by the time Warhammer 40,000 actually came out, there were already a good number of Space Marine miniatures available to field in your games, and as it was initially a skirmish game, you actually didn't need that many of them. Not to mention the fact that individually, the Space Marines were surprisingly strong. The typical human Imperial Army trooper had a weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, and toughness of 3. The standard Space Orc had a weapon skill, ballistic skill, and strength of 3, but a toughness of 4. And then the basic Marine was a little bit more impressive. It had a weapon skill, ballistic skill, and strength of 4, but only a toughness of 3 initially. Of course, this wouldn't stay the case for too long. The core rules of Rogue Trader set down the basic order of battle for all of these standardized troop types. Models are organized into fighting units. A unit can be any number of models from 5 upwards, but you will find it most convenient to have units of either 5 or 10 models. And in the bestiary entry for the Marines themselves, we find out a little bit more about their unit organization and command structure. Each chapter is led by a veteran Marine with the rank of Imperial Commander. The warriors themselves are divided into fighting squads of 10 troopers, each led by a sergeant. 10 such squads make up a company, led by a captain. Shortly after the release of Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, White Dwarf would step up to the plate and begin publishing a series of very influential articles that expanded the scope of the 40k universe. They added lots of lore and background, and importantly rules that would help to create the 40k that would go on to become a juggernaut. The Index Astartes column in White Dwarf issue 97 from January 1988 was written by David Wise and Rick Priestley and covered the organization of the Ultramarines. The article detailed their military disposition, as well as a history of the chapter, notable personalities, and some suitably intriguing thoughts for the day. Our presence remakes the past. The way in which Space Marine warrior companies work was explained in detail. Each company led by a captain and a lieutenant and made up of 10 squads of 10 men. In the company organization section, the roles of the squads themselves were explained even further. All troops are trained to perform in any of the types of squad. The distinction is a tactical one, rather than being indicative of different training or ability, although special assault squads are always made up of the most experienced Marines. This was followed by a table indicating the makeup of companies 1 to 9, as including a chaplain, 1 special assault squad, 2 assault squads, 1 heavy weapon squad, and 6 tactical squads. The 10th company, meanwhile, featured only 1 tactical squad and 9 reconnaissance squads, the forebears of the Scout Marines. So, from the very first breakdown of an actual Space Marine chapter's organization, the idea of a tactical Marine was present, a fully trained trooper that could fulfill a variety of battlefield roles. But there was one slight nuance, because in the first supplement for 40k, the Book of the Astronomicon, there would be a listing of different types of tactical trooper. They were not exclusive to the Space Marines. The presentation of Army List's introduction brings with it an explanation of the nature of a tactical trooper, almost as a generic default for any army, and it is expounded upon in a sense far more general than just for Space Marines. Squads. This section of the Army List describes the actual fighting units, the troops who will probably make up the bulk of your force. Note that players are obliged to buy a whole squad, normally 10 models. In actual play, of course, these squads may be broken down into tactical units of 5 models each. As a result of this general approach, it meant that whilst the Space Marine Army List features a specific option for tactical squads, so too do the squats, and the Imperial Army, and even Orc vehicles can carry Orc tactical squads. Though we must remember, of course, that this was still a time when Orcs could have commissars. White Dwarf 105 in September 1988 would make clear, though, that the tactical designation for some squads in the Space Marines was more than just a generic descriptor. It was a specific name. For any given battle, squads are equipped and organized according to organizational requirements, and this results in 3 basic types of squad: tactical, assault, and devastator. Tactical squads are all-purpose units, capable of accomplishing most battlefield tasks. Assault and Devastator squads are equipped for close combat and heavy weapon support, respectively. Much as in 2026 with the release of the 11th edition Codex for Space Marines, it's been determined by Games Workshop that the troopers are just not tough enough, they're not strong enough, they no longer occupy that elite status that Space Marines are supposed to have according to the background fluff. Well, that also happened in 1990, when Games Workshop decided that the Space Marines needed a little helping hand. Issue 129 of White Dwarf from September 1990's Rick Priestley penned article suggested that the first Codex Space Marine book was on the way, a title that wouldn't actually be released for about 5 more years as Codex Ultramarines. But the article provided a lot more than that tease. There was an extensive look at the form and history of power armor, including a wonderful breakdown of each previous armor mark, and there would also be new rules for the standard Space Marine. Warhammer 40,000 players will only be too aware that on the tabletop, Space Marines often fail to live up to their fearsome reputation. A couple of years ago, when the game first came out, Space Marines were easily able to take on the likes of Orcs, Eldar, and whatever else the Warhammer 40,000 player cared to throw at them. However, over the ensuing years, new models and new rules for their enemies have gradually shifted the balance of power, so that the once mighty Space Marines are now looking a little less heroic. Of course, this is hardly appropriate. The remainder of the article would explain that Marines now got a +1 bonus to hit in close combat, thanks to automatic weight compensators in their power armor, and that their legendary bravery meant that they could not be routed, merely shaken. This, along with other developing lore, would help to transition the Space Marines from the slightly unhinged chaps that they may have been in the Rogue Trader initial days, to that increasingly noble questing space knight kind of vibe. Then, of course, there was that major stat line increase. It brought the toughness of the regular Space Marine from 3 to 4, making these standard troops a relative powerhouse on the battlefield. It is only until very recently that this has actually been changed again, as the 11th edition of the game has taken the standard strength from 4 up to 5 for a typical Space Marine, and in certain cases raised the toughness up to 5 as well. It's fascinating to think that it only took 3 years for that initial stat line increase to take place, but there has then been a subsequent 36-year wait for the next stat line increase for these standard Space Marine troops. So it can never be said that power creep is a modern invention. But along with that incredible article about the history of power armor, about the Space Marines and their development, about their role within the 40k universe, we would also see the debut of a brand new set of metal Space Marine miniatures, and they came in this quite fantastic Space Marine Strike Force. In line with the evolving style and look of Space Marine power armor, sculptor Jez Goodwin, whose Space Marine captains were already a sublime addition to the range, sculpted 3 new standard Space Marine bodies. They were wearing the Mark VII armor variant that had first appeared on tables in 1989 with the epic scale Space Marine game, and which had been heralded by the incredible Jim Burns box art that would be reused for this box set too. Released in late 1990, the Space Marine Strike Force box included 5 of each of the 3 Goodwin Metal Marines, along with a range of plastic sprues for their arms, pauldrons, backpacks, and weapons, allowing you to assemble 15 Mark VII Marines. Even though the Strike Force suggested that you could create up to 3 combat squads, rather than specifically calling them tactical squads on the box, releases like the Armies of the Imperium set for the epic scale Space Marine game in 1991 further entrenched the concept of the tactical companies and tactical squads, making them essentially the basic troop deployment for the Adeptus Astartes. With the release of the 2nd edition boxed set for Warhammer 40,000, the famous Black Codex would codify the Space Marine Tactical Squad in the updated army list. There were still tactical squads available for the Imperial Guard as well, but in time, even those would fall away, just as the references to tactical troops for other factions already had. The tactical squad would increasingly become a preserve of just the Space Marines, completing its journey for generic term for generic troops across generic armies to something far more specific and directly related to the military deployments of the Adeptus Astartes. There are many pivotal moments in the history of the Space Marines and their development into the default model for 40k. Not least are the plastic Imperial Space Marines that came in both the RTB01 Space Marine box set and the 40k 2nd edition starter box. Both of those sprues of plastic brilliance deserve their own full videos, no doubt about it. But for now, I'm just talking about this fantastic mixture of metal and plastic, a box set that I think is both beautiful and meaningful. Referred to as RTB15 by some folks, given that it was the 15th box release for Warhammer 40,000, this box is really, really cool. By the time it hit shelves in late 1990, Warhammer 40,000 had already evolved dramatically from those early Rogue Trader roots that had been dug just 3 years earlier. Through White Dwarf articles, supplementary rulebooks, and the ever-expanding Citadel miniatures range, the game and its setting had already changed in essential ways that were both big and small by the time this box set came out. That change was exemplified, I think, by the arrival of these new Metal Marines. They were not the first Mark 7s. They were not the first Jez Goodwin Marines. This box was not even the first use of this Jim Burns art. But that is part of the clear statement that the box makes by bringing together a new default. The Beaky Marines were on their way out. The Mark 7s were arriving in force. The art would continue to depict more and more of this style of Marine, and the model range would reflect those as well. They now had higher toughness, prouder stances, and a more versatile miniature range. These were truly becoming the tactical Marines that could be deployed in any role, in any Space Marine army, on any battlefield. As is so often the case with Games Workshop development history, it is a broad and deep topic that I just haven't got time to continue exploring right now. I have done videos about units like the Terminators and the Scouts, vehicles like Dreadnoughts and Land Raiders, so you can go and check out those if you want more Space Marine development history. And I would love to return to this topic again in the future. Just let me know what bits of the Astartes loadout, whether that's units or armies, chapters, or other bits of lore from Space Marine background that you would love to see me explore in the future. And if you want to support my work documenting, researching, interviewing, and exploring the history of Warhammer and Games Workshop, please consider checking out patreon.com/Jordan Sorcery. It's the only way I can keep doing this work. There is loads of exclusive content there. There's also free stuff that you get just by signing up for free at the free level. You can see quizzes and background stuff, articles, interviews. There's loads of good stuff, so do consider checking it out. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.